Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. Well, let's get into this interview, and I'm very pleased to be talking today with Reginé Gilbert. Hello, Regine. How are you doing today?
Hi, it's good to be here. I'm so happy to be talking to you today.
Yeah, well, we hadn't talked before, so it's really good to be able to meet you in this format. And I'm in my home office in Vashon, Washington, which is an island near Seattle. You either have a beautiful background or a beautiful place, but why don't you let us know where you're talking to us from?
Yeah, so I'm sitting in my office at NYU in Brooklyn, New York.
All right. Well, I'm glad we're able to get together for this, and probably a good place to start is if you just talk a little bit about the work that you're doing right now, and then we kind of go from there.
Sure. So I'm currently an industry assistant professor in the Integrated Design and Media program that's part of the Tandon School of Engineering, and I teach user experience design as well as I co-teach an assistive tech class with Gus Chalkias, and we teach students about the assistive tech that blind and low vision folks use. Gus is blind, and then I bring in the UX piece, and he is definitely way more of an expert on assistive tech than me, but I have learned so much from him, and teaching the classes is a lot of fun. And this upcoming semester, I'm actually going to be teaching a voice user interface class for the first time and incorporating accessibility into it.
That's everything you just talked about is really progressive. Is that department that you're in, particularly pointed toward providing that type of curriculum content, or is it something that you've kind of helped foster there?
Yeah, so this department I really love because it's really diverse in the learnings that students can get. My colleagues are, experts in virtual reality and augmented reality and wearables and technology and art and like biology and really like working with plants and technology. So there's like all kinds of things that folks are working on in my department. So students have a lot of options when it comes to learning.
Well, I want to talk more about the work that you're doing now, but one of the themes of this series of interviews that I'm doing is to look at the journey that people have taken that has resulted in where they are today. Maybe you could think about a place that you'd like to pick as a starting point. It doesn't have to be accessibility specific, but just maybe help us understand what some of the formative things were that got you on the journey to where you are today.
Yeah, one of the things that had a huge impact on me when I was growing up is my cousin Tammy is deaf, and being like interacting with her, learning a little bit of sign language, getting to see how she is in the world, and that really had a lot of influence on me. Saying, I think I started questioning when I was young, like, why isn't more stuff better? Like, why isn't this thing better? Why isn't this thing better? And why can't we do more things better to communicate? And then, fast forward years later, I worked in information technology for a lot of years, and I got bored and started taking UX classes. And in my UX class, there was one slide about accessibility. This is what I remember clearly. And I think that sparked something else in me. And that led me to wanting to learn more and going to a meetup. And from there, it's just, I dove, I dove right on in, and got really interested in learning, and incorporating it into my UX job. I created guidelines at one job, and nobody asked for them. I created accessibility guidelines, because I was so interested in it. I really wanted people to apply it to their work. And then I started teaching UX in 2015 at General Assembly, and I incorporated accessibility into my courses by having my students do a lot of assumptions around what, in particular, blind folks might do when they're in the kitchen. And I would have my students come up with a concept, sketch it out. And I say, you should be able to describe this. And then I actually brought in folks who were blind to critique. And that really was informative for my students to say, oh, this is user experience, right? You have to talk to people. You can't just assume, because all of their ideas were busted, right? Like they realized, we can't really make stuff if we don't involve and talk to the people who this applies to.
Well, just going back a little bit, before the teaching, to that work that you were doing in UX for organizations, I know, as a lot of us, that's a logical step for a lot of us, but sometimes, we'll do things, but then we run into obstacles at an organization that maybe isn't ready to put in the resources. Some of the fortunate few find that they're, immediately supported. What was that experience like for you? Not necessarily, specifics about an organization, but what was your experience there?
I've had both, where people are very supportive and where people just don't care. So when I was getting support and the higher ups were like, yeah, let's do all of the things. It just made my life easier, made my job easier. It was easier for communication between the developers and our teams. And when we didn't, have support, or it was a challenge. It was a huge challenge to kind of fight for what's right, but then have to back down.
And in those situations, what type of strategies did you use? Was it like a return on investment metrics about maybe an audience that was new, or was it kind of more the stick versus the carrot related to legal, or what were some of the ways that you were able to build support for that or build a case for your work?
The ways that I built a case was search engine optimization and partnering with the marketing teams and the search engine folks. That was one that was very successful. Another way, is to dangle that carrot about the legal reasons why we should be accessible. And then I think the biggest and best strategy is to just ask questions. And to ask questions that are promoting accessibility, but without saying the words. Because what I found in my previous work experience is when I said accessibility, automatically people would shut down, say that's too hard, right? So then it was asking the questions, are we sure about these colors? Are we sure we want to do this thing, right? Have we thought about this, right? So just asking questions related to what we were working on and seeing what people would answer. Because then I could say, oh, we could maybe try this, or, So that was my way around it. I think asking questions is the best thing anyone can do to get people to think. I like to say as an educator, I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only hope that the questions that I ask provoke people to think.
Well, it sounds like a great approach, and you know, you mentioned the SEO, which is something that that I've delved into related to accessibility. But I think a lot of people, even in the accessibility area, may not understand the how the two pieces can really work together with accessibility components adding signals to search engine optimization. And was that something that you just like identified individually, or do you have some colleagues in marketing where you explored this area?
Oh yeah. So in one particular instance, I worked directly with the search engine optimization person, like the person in the company. And I was like, and he was like, I know that accessibility helps SEO. I don't know how it does it exactly, but I know it works. And so I said, okay, great. And he was so happy to have someone, support him, and he supported me. And then we got marketing involved, and marketing's like, yeah, we need to be at the top of Google. So how can we do this?
Well, now that you're involved in the work at NYU and in teaching regularly, yeah, how does that kind of manifest itself with your students? Are they interested specifically in that topic, or they maybe are just exploring it, or a mix, or kind of how is that set up where you're at?
Yeah, so I teach user experience design primarily, and I incorporate accessibility from day one. Like, we start talking about it from the beginning, and therefore the students work on my students will work on individual projects and team projects, and their team projects are always with a real life client. Both their team and individual projects have accessibility components in them from the beginning, from the research phase, from the planning phase. And just this past semester and even this summer, my students are working on a project that is through ERISA Labs, and ERISA Labs received a grant from NASA to make the eclipse that are upcoming in the next couple years accessible, in particular to the blind and low vision community through sound. And so this particular project involves a lot of data and sound. And so my students last semester did a lot of research in regards to best practice. They did user interviews. They did, looking at scholarly articles. And this summer, my grad research assistant and I are working on the designs. And to do that, we have been working with subject matter experts, as well as people getting input from folks in the blind and low vision community. So we are in my teaching is also practice, because we're always working with real life clients every semester.
Well, one of the things that I read recently was the article that I saw on LinkedIn, which was where you're talking about developing accessibility guidelines for extended reality, and that was an area. I mean, there's so many areas of accessibility; it's hard to keep up with everything. But it was one that I hadn't really been familiar with, thought about it all. But I found the article really illuminating. Maybe talk a little bit about that technology and your work specifically in that area.
Sure. So I, in my past life, I had a consulting business, and I worked in a co-working space with a group that was working on augmented reality. And they were like, we need UX help. And I was like, what is this stuff you're working on? It seems cool. And so I ended up doing some usability testing for this augmented reality company, and that kind of got me into the what they call XR. Some people, it's extended reality. So extended reality XR is an umbrella term for virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and any sort of immersive technology or anything that's using spatial computing. AI could fall in that umbrella too. And so I started thinking about, and this came from last summer, what I was talking to Gus, my co-teacher for the assistive technology class, and I was talking to him about Pokemon Go. And he said, I wish I could play Pokemon Go. And then I thought to myself, well, okay, Gus is blind and he can't play Pokemon Go because it's not accessible. Why isn't it? And why isn't augmented reality accessible? And so last summer, my students worked with Gus and a company called Rose Digital to create concepts around accessible augmented reality. So they didn't build anything, but they did create concepts. And that had me thinking about accessibility overall in the XR space, and where does it start? Where do you start? And he said, well, people start with the tools. And are these tools accessible, not just from a standpoint disability, but accessible from a cost perspective? And so my grad assistant, Saki Asakawa, and I went through as many tools as we could find, the popular tools, and we looked at about 60 tools, specifically looking at the price, looking at the hardware needed, software needed to run these programs, and if there was any accessibility associated with them. And from there, we ended up writing this article, and we created a subway map, which this upcoming semester, I hope I can make in a tactile version. But we created a subway map, and the subway map lists out what's free, what costs money, what has accessibility related, and each subway line is a purpose. So there's, for like drawing or things of that nature. So that's kind of the long story of how I got into that. And in addition to that, I'm part of XR Access, which was started by Cornell Tech, and it's really it's a large group working to make sure that accessibility is getting built into this emerging technology that a lot more people are using. And I'm also doing research with design patterns with an organization called Veil, and it's researchers from all over the world examining design patterns with different titles. And then I'm working on a second book, which is I'm co-authoring with Doug Northcook, and it's about the human side of spatial computing, where we will talk about accessibility in there. So yeah, that's in a nutshell how I got into the XR space and what I'm doing now.
Well, yeah, that's a great story to hear about that, and it's obviously going to be something that we're going to be learning about and working with more and more moving into the future. You briefly mentioned a new book and some things that you're working on. Maybe talk a little bit about what future plans or things that you're currently really passionate about. Anything you can share about your latest projects?
Yeah, sure. So so the NASA Soundscapes project is an ongoing project. It's a 5-year project, and my students will be every semester working on something different with the project. And my research around inclusive and accessible XR, it continues. I'm hoping in the coming time to actually, because of the pandemic, I felt a little thrown off with where do I go? What do I do if I'm not able to be, with people? So what I'm working on now, or what I've been working on over the summer, is looking at inclusiveness and accessibility for different titles, specifically with one type of headset. So it's my hope to expand that to try other headsets and see how that goes. And in addition, continue working and researching for my book and getting real understanding of the layout of the the space and really the human side of things, and how we can make these experiences overall more accessible, not just from a disability perspective, but from a true inclusive perspective.
Well, you obviously keep yourself really busy.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat with me. And good luck with your book. And hopefully we can meet sometime in the physical world. But if not, it is really great chatting with you.
Thank you so much, Joe.